Hi, I'm Isaias Hernandez.
Hi, I'm Dr. Suzanne Pierre.
And we are
Teaching Climate Together.
Thank you so much for being here with me today, Dr. Suzanne Pierre. Can you tell us more about your story?
Yeah, for sure. So I am an ecosystems ecologist and biogeochemist, and those scientific backgrounds really connect the ways that plants, microbes, and other parts of the environment exchange resources and energy. So I study the ways that soils, the microbes that live in soil, and plants that rely on that soil are responding to changing climate and other environmental factors. And I do this work as the director of an organization called the Ecology Lab.
So I've heard about ecology labs before, but what is Critical Ecology Lab?
So I founded the Critical Ecology Lab in around 2020, 2021. We're a nonprofit research organization and social change organization. So we're different from a lot of the ecology labs that you might have heard of, that are usually run by a professor within a university. Critical Ecology Lab is an independent organization that is trying to both change the types of questions that we ask in environmental change research, as well as the way that we do our research, all towards the goals of social liberation and ending oppression.
And with this Critical Ecology Labs, it's the intersection between academia, climate communications, and also racial histories that need to be incorporated in these science models. Can you kind of talk more about the importance of why we need to be talking about the racial histories about these ecologies?
Yeah, I think in research in general, there is a sense that being scientific, being objective in order to come up with new information requires us to separate history from the way that we actually study natural phenomena. And in the Critical Ecology Lab, we're drawing on a long tradition of different scholars and activists who've been saying, no, actually, history, particularly racialized histories of disparities in power, are really influential on how the environment has been shaped. And if we don't connect those relationships, those environmental and social factors, we're doing a disservice to the information that we produce. And we will be ill-equipped for the type of environmental crises we're facing now and in the future.
And it seems like as science continues to reproduce these reports around, data and facts, the storytelling component is often not there. And histories is what tells us the stories of what has happened to the land. And this kind of brings me to this concept that you helped coin, is critical ecology, which I'm very interested for people that never really heard about this term, of what it means to you in the lab.
I will not claim that I came up with the phrase critical ecology. I think it's been used in different ways, but I will say that when I started using the phrase critical ecology to talk about the research that I and my colleagues do, it was really to use the sense of critical that comes from critical theory. Critical theory, which is kind of the discipline of the humanities, philosophy, and so forth, which analyzes how differences in power, those who have and those who have not, are actually the mechanisms or drivers of what shapes our world, right? When power is had, it can be used to change both society as well as nature. Critical ecology is saying, well, what if we take that analysis of power, of equality versus inequality, and apply it to how we think about the ways that nature has been shaped by society? I think that's a way that we're going deeper than a lot of environmental researchers by saying, the nature of nature really depends on who we are and how we are in society. And so we need to incorporate those two things in our research.
One of the things that really fascinated me about critical ecology and the work that you do with the team is actually advocating for the clarifications in the ways that we write our stories and write it within academia. So for example, when we talk about industrialization here in America, we're often talking about the land that has been degraded due to tilling. However, there is this common denominator that is shared in academic scientists of not understanding who was tilling. And I think there's work that you all do talking about the importance of recognizing slavery, of how it has really changed landscapes. And I really am interested to learn more about that.
Yeah, I think you really put a nice frame around the fact that who has done action that has shaped the landscapes and shaped ecosystems matters just as much as how those landscapes have changed. And just removing, the specific nature of why certain land changes have taken place and who benefited from those land changes really alters how we understand the ways that nature is kind of changing and unfolding right in front of us. So the example that you brought up that we study in the Critical Ecology Lab is kind of the impact of chattel slavery in the US, the Caribbean, and Latin America. The main motivator for slavery was the production of capital wealth. So that means that any land use change that happened with relation to the violent institution of slavery directly benefited an entire global economy and specific populations within it. If we don't make that clear connection between the wealth that was amassed in Western Europe as a result of land use change under chattel slavery in the Americas, we will continue to think of ecology here in America, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, as just being this kind of random occurrence that took place and shaped all of the forests and different landscapes that we see today. But if we make that relationship between a changing economy in Europe and a growing economy in Europe and the land use change that happened here, we can see that ecosystems, even when they're disconnected by continents, by oceans, are deeply connected by human will and impact. And so I think that allows us to better think about in the future how our actions, how the influence of economies, industries, governments are directly and indirectly impacting ecosystems. It's a way to shift how we think in our society about what drives ecological change.
Yeah, and there's this degradation, what you're saying here is the degradation of ecological wealth that is happening, where in academic science, and even my experience studying ecology at one point in undergrad, you go to these landscapes, you talk about how academia is often used as resource acquisition, this justification. There's no connection to the land other than this acknowledgement from scientists saying, yes, the land is degraded. However, you kind of push back and say, in order to address these power imbalances, there needs to be an acknowledgement that these systems were not done by those communities currently living and having those devastations, and also if you can talk more about this separation that those communities face and the traumas and relationships that they have.
Oh my gosh, you hit on like 4 different topics there, so I'm going to try to address each one. But yes, you're threading that needle really nicely. So I think the first thing that you mentioned, which is really relevant, is research itself is its own wealth generating project. I know that we think of science and research as being this kind of truly kind of beneficial process for society writ large. But there are huge imbalances in who gets to do research, who gets access to certain locations to go collect specimens, soils, plants, you name it, and the ways that those permissions are being given. And so all of that really depends on, disparities in power between what we think of as developed countries like the US, which are really colonial powers, and those that have been colonized, the destinations for research in many cases, where those people who are in those local research sites or field sites are just sort of expected to allow and absorb the impact of these visiting researchers coming in and out of their land. So inherent in research is this kind of unfairness, right? And that really connects to that history of the difference between, a colonizing power and the colonized landscape that is generating wealth for kind of this global economy. So these power relationships are really long-standing. And one thing that we think about in the Critical Ecology Lab is how do we actually, in our practice of doing research right now, how do we undo some of those norms that have been built up over centuries? How do we operate a little differently in how we partner with and empower people who are local to these research sites? How do we, not just rely on and kind of get comfortable with the fact that just because we're based here in so-called US and we can get permits to travel and collect soils, that's not enough of the permission and the respect that we should give. So that's one way that we're trying to provide a model for an alternative way to do research that is more ethical, that is more equitable, that is acknowledging these long-standing power imbalances.
Soil is a living system. It has organisms. It has a symbiotic relationships with those species. So what does soil mean to you? And why did you fall and collapse yourself into soil work?
Yeah, I mean, it honestly started when I was just a kid. Like, I grew up just playing in my backyard a lot and gardening with my parents. My parents were just visiting the other day, and it just kind of reminded me of like how much time we just spent like planting and replanting trees and like other, shrubs in the backyard. That was like our summer break was like, we're doing this. I was like, can I go to the pool? They're like, no. And so whether I liked it or not, I was just going to be, playing with my hands in the dirt. And I really understood like fundamentally that like in order for, the plants that my parents were planting and, tending to survive and to thrive, that there had to be care for soil as well. Like that was just like, we are putting compost, we're putting manure. My father is endlessly putting wood chips on top of, like around trees. And for some reason, that's like our number one Saturday afternoon activity. And I understood just from direct experience that like these ways of taking care of soil feed back to plants. And I didn't start out wanting to be like a scientist. Not at all. I literally was told to my face, like, you're not a STEM kid. You should like really focus on English. Yeah. In like high school. And it wasn't until kind of the end of high school that I was like, I'm not like comfortable with chemistry. I'm not like a super strong like math student, but I am like very interested in the environment and like environmental science. And so I kind of like put it in my back pocket that I was gonna like do something environment, but like I didn't really think that science was it for me. But I like was obsessed with soil. Like I just thought it was so fascinating. And I read this book, which I like occasionally bring up. It's a tiny little book. It's called Dirt: The Ecstatic Skin of the Earth.
I want to read that book now too.
It's a delightful little book, but it's this kind of series of like vignettes, narratives about people who have like studied or interacted with or worked with soil in some way, ranging from like the OG soil scientist, Hans Jenny, who is like one of the sort of main folks who kind of formalized soil science as we know it in the Western world today. Reading that book kind of in high school and then rereading it in college, I had this feeling of like, there are lots of things that I'm not going to be good at, but there are a lot of things that I could like get good at. And even if it's scary and even if I've been told that, it's not for me, there's something about soil that is so, I don't know, I can't like overstate how spiritual or kind of poetic I find it, that like was like, you kind of have to overcome what you're scared of to really commit yourself and like marry that love of yours, So that's why I ended up doing soil science and ecosystems ecology. And I guess that's where my love of critical ecology comes from.
It seems like, there's always this curiosity and that desire to question the unknown. And I feel like you really collapsed yourself into that realm of saying, I may not know if this is for me. I may not know if this will be my career. And I may not know if this will be my playground, but I will make it the best I can. And I think that really speaks to volume of the ways that you speak about soil and you honor those roots. And also the vintage book, I really want to read it now because I'm very obsessed with like academic old school like textbooks that have that unique designs, and like, it's just something that's really sacred and rare. And while you got into soil and like while you put yourself through these experiences, obviously it was not easy for you. Like it was, it's very traumatic for many scholars. And like, I know that one of the things that is often not talked about is the experience of Black scholars in academia. And I think that's one of the things that people would really want to know more. It's like, what were your experiences and how have you continued to battle against these types of systems?
Yeah, I mean, without doing like a trauma bond on camera, because do we need to do that? I appreciate you asking me that, first of all, because I know that you have had like really difficult experiences in academia or with the culture of academia as well. And I think that's really what it comes down to. there's this idea that I think that like certain topics or certain, technical fields are, and it's complete bullshit, if I can say that on here. Please bleep it out if you need to. But like, that like certain technical fields are not for, or Black and brown people are not, and femme people are not prepared for those kinds of fields. And I find that like that is, not only just untrue, but the pervasiveness of that idea prevents us from coming up with the solutions that are so necessary today, particularly because a combination of technical and social and kind of intuition-based skills are needed to solve the climate crisis. And it's this, system of keeping certain groups of people out by perpetuating these false narratives. Those narratives still exist, but if I can kind of push back against them, like unlearn them myself and also help other people to unlearn them, we're going to be headed in a better direction, maybe, knock on wood.
Yeah, like let's hope so. Which I think is true in some sense, because I also had the assumption of when I left undergrad and graduated, I was like, I'll never go to grad school. Academia is horrible. But then I had to be pushed back myself to be like, actually, there's many Black, Indigenous, people of color scholars in these fields. Many of them are talking about their research. Many of them are pushing back against these systems that are often not designed as well as resourced for these communities. So there is that hope. There is that change that's actually happening. And that's not to say no one's doing that work.
Yeah. Those people are out there. I'm like proud to be one of those people. I'm proud to know those people. And, I feel like I could go into the stories of all the different bad things that happened. Of course, yeah. But, I think the more valuable thing to say in this moment is like, I have come out on the other side, and rather than sort of kind of trying to prove people wrong, prove those, teachers or professors wrong that I could do the things that they thought I couldn't do, I'm actually much more interested in looking at things that they never even thought of doing themselves and creating pathways that simply aren't there, because why try to fit into and prove something that isn't for you when something entirely different, something like the Critical Ecology Lab, which is just a different approach altogether, is what is needed in this moment. I think not having conversations with people who are not actually in productive conversation with you and with your vision is actually like one of the most important lessons I've learned, because it's wasted energy.
Imagination plays a huge role in Critical Ecology Labs, and I want to know, what is that future and vision for yourself?
So in Critical Ecology Lab, we think about our structure as being 3 parts: knowledge production, sense making, and solution design. Knowledge production really includes the research end of things, where we're doing original scientific studies, analyzing data sets to produce kind of new conclusions and develop and show new relationships involving social and ecological phenomena. And developing new theories that are useful to other researchers and beyond. And so that's kind of how we're influencing who produces knowledge and how that knowledge gets produced and how expertise is developed. And then there's sense making. So we say that it's a term that other folks have used to really take a little bit of emphasis away from education and really focus on the idea that in everyday life, there are ways that we can take really complicated, interrelated problems and break them down into pieces that we can kind of digest and understand and make sense of. Critical Ecology Lab is trying to develop that aspect, which includes things like our Liberation Ecology field course.
Well, I need to take this walk.
Yeah.
I need to get into this course.
Yeah, it's a very incredible 6-week, probably more program that we're excited about expanding. Yeah. So that's part of sense making, but sense making also includes publications that are for a general audience, interactive digital media, and even series going forward that we hope to produce. So sense making is kind of, I think, one of our growth areas. And solution design is, I think, our biggest growth area. It's kind of the biggest unknown in how Critical Ecology Lab will develop. I think it really requires us to bring on new team members, and I'm excited about seeing our team grow from the 4 folks that are currently on staff to include folks with design backgrounds, engineering backgrounds, data scientist backgrounds, to think about how we can create tools, how we can create analytical frameworks, and even hardware that can be used to address and upend some of these relationships between kind of settler colonial mindsets and ecological change and crisis.
I love this because this is something I would have literally wanted to do or work for as an undergrad.
We would have loved to have you.
I know, in a different lifetime, I would have been working at the Critical Ecology Lab. I'm joined by Dr. M. Whalen, postdoctoral research scientist at the Critical Ecology Lab. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk to you today.
So I'm really interested in what your role is and what do you do here as a scientist?
I just finished my PhD in environmental science.
Ooh, congrats.
Thank you. And joined the lab almost 2 months ago. And my background is in biogeochemistry and ecosystem ecology, similar to Dr. Pierre's. And so one of my primary roles will be helping to develop out the research programs at Critical Ecology Lab, and in particular starting off with our project that we'll be carrying out in St. Croix on the ecological scars of plantation slavery.
I really love hearing your story because you didn't go the trajectory after finishing your PhD. I mean, most scholars would then go to work in academia to the process to be tenured, but you actually went to the Critical Ecology Lab to redefine the new ways of academia. And I'm really interested in why you did that.
So I think from a personal perspective, as I got farther and farther along in my graduate program, I realized how hyper-specialized we become in our specific research areas.
Very siloed.
Very siloed. And I, in particular, was studying these kind of fine-scale mechanistic questions about the soil and processes in soil that felt pretty disconnected from the big picture motivations for wanting to get involved in environmental research in the first place, which for me was wanting to play a role in helping to develop solutions to mitigate climate change and to mitigate this crisis, both from a perspective of care for the environment, but also care for people. And so I think that as I got farther and farther along in my program, I started to kind of carve out a different path for myself to be able to engage in some of these more critical dialogues with colleagues and also students. And I was really doing that mostly through education and teaching that I was involved in. And I think one big kind of core element of that for me was helping people to engage in conversations about the systemic roots of our current climate and environmental crises, and really using that as an avenue towards helping people to understand how that really fundamentally shifts our understanding of the scale and nature of solutions that are required to address these problems. When we understand that the roots of that these large-scale systems and social structures of power, colonialism, white supremacy, imperialism, have given rise both to environmental damage but also to social injustice, we start to see that the scale of our responses needs to respond at a systemic level, and also needs to understand how these things have been coupled throughout time.
Yeah, I love that because I think the general scholar looks at these solutions as very granular, very hyper-specific, like you were saying, but instead we're actually trying to redefine the ways of how we approach those solutions and talk about it. So what does that practice look like when it comes to education? Because I know that many undergrads, and even myself, I was taught to think very rigid, very siloed, and very much like granular, but that's not the case for critical ecology and the work that you do specifically.
So I guess one element of this and how I've approached it is by really challenging this idea and framing around a universal human nature and these ideas that are implicated in concepts like the Anthropocene, and which we hate, and we have these concepts embedded in lots of different fields. So in soils, we have this concept of anthrosols, so this idea of a universal human impact on soil. And when we talk about biomes or ecosystems, there's this idea of anthromes. And so I think one kind of approach to that I've taken is helping people to unpack the limitations of those concepts and understanding that it's really specific human activities that originate from or stem from these power systems that are motivating different types of human disturbance to land, to ecosystems. And I think really importantly that really expands our understanding of the solutions that are possible. So if we
makes you a better researcher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think if we kind of reorient our mind around that, it can kind of give us hope. When we're framing this idea of a universal human nature, we can sometimes come to think about human activity having these inevitable impacts on the environment. So when we start to unpack what specific forms of human activity and the power structures that motivated those types of disturbances and perturbations, we can start to know where to invest our energy towards, and understanding that human relationships to the environment have been otherwise, they are otherwise today, and they can be otherwise again. So I think it kind of helps us engage more in that imagining alternative futures that we want to live in and how that is actually possible.
And what is some of that pushback that you've gotten when addressing those power imbalances? Because the narratives around human supremacy and the Anthropocene is very plagued, right? This idea that we as people have degraded the land and we're at fault. But then when we're examining these power structures, like you were saying, like industrialization that use racialized capitalism on Black and brown bodies, we're not really doing the justice to illustrate, like, it was not those communities that wanted to degrade the land. And sometimes academics have a hard time reconciling with white supremacy. So how do we really navigate those conversations when it comes to that?
My mind is going first to some of the experiences I've had working with white colleagues and engaging in these dialogues. I think oftentimes in academia, when we're starting to engage with the idea that white supremacy and colonialism has really shaped our fields of science, has shaped our institutions, people are looking for you to kind of hand them simple, tangible ways that they can start to be quote unquote anti-racist, or to be an advocate or ally for DEI initiatives within the academy. And I think that people start to get, white people in particular, get overwhelmed or a little stuck when they start to realize the scale of the problem and the systemic nature of the problem. And when we realize that in order to affect meaningful change in our institutions, we're really going to have to work towards structural change. I think where I've seen people get kind of stuck in that is not understanding how they as an individual and their actions as an individual connect to those larger scales. And so I think that part of what I've tried to do in my work and what I would love to continue doing in CEL is engaging people and understanding how our individual actions really need to be understood within that structural context. So how are we understanding our individual actions as refusing or disrupting existing social structures, and not just working towards small changes that are essentially offering greater assimilation or inclusion within existing structures, but really understanding the role that scientists have played in, and science has played in creating and upholding existing social structures. So I talk a lot with people about how science historically has been used as a tool of legitimation for upholding power structures. And I think that it can become powerful to understand the role that scientists played in upholding and justifying these structures in the first place, because it means that scientists have a role in dismantling those structures.
Yeah, and it further improves research. This is why we need more white allies like you in this space, because it is very difficult to bring these conversations up, even with professors who have done decades of research in their specific fields, yet will acknowledge the fact of history of saying, yes, this happened back then, but yet are not recognizing what's happening right now as a current issue of the symptom of what was being addressed back then.
Definitely.
You know, I'm turned off working at labs because I had a horrible experience in undergrad where I was often forced to work in a cubicle, and it's very siloed of having to become apolitical, not sharing anything that's political, or making sure that you don't jeopardize any research opportunities. To the Critical Ecology Lab, how do they foster culture, and why do they depart from the standard norm of academic research?
So I think my experience, and one of the reasons that I wanted to work in Critical Ecology Lab, is that from the get-go, it felt like we were able to bring our full selves, our full humanity, our queerness, our vulnerability, our grief into our science, into our work, into the question-asking process, and entering this work as full people with histories. So Sue and I were engaging in a conversation the other day about this really interesting paper from the early 90s by Mary O'Brien, and she kind of opens it by talking about how science is always already political. And so when we choose to ask certain questions and not others, that's a political decision. And I think oftentimes we're taught this myth of value neutrality or objectivity in science, that we think we're being, by not resisting the status quo, by not taking any action, we think we're being apolitical. But it's not actually through the process of engaging with a practice such as critical ecology that we become political. Our science is already political by nature of these systems of power that are embedded within our institutions. And so I think from critical ecology, one of our strengths is kind of being able to enter into the research space, understanding that role of power and how it's shaped question asking throughout the history of science and into the present, and really using that as a way of grounding the types of questions we're asking, and also, so not only in our work, but also the type of culture and environment that we're creating.
And that goes into this research projects that Critical Ecology Lab is working on. Like, I know you mentioned the Caribbean project as one of those ecological scars of the plantation. And I'm very curious to know more about that research project and the importance of actually bringing it more to global north countries and areas of how research is being conducted.
Yeah, so just to share a little bit more about that project, our broad goal is to really understand how the geographical and spatial footprint of colonial plantations throughout the Caribbean reshaped ecosystems. And we'll be focusing on, in the beginning, how those plantation systems reshaped soils. So we're essentially going into this with the hypothesis that these specific systems of colonial plantations influenced landscapes in ways that are distinct and more intensive than subsequent histories of agricultural land use, for instance. And so our hypotheses are really delving into understanding whether looking at using history and information from the humanities to influence our question asking, whether that can help us understand how ecosystems have been differentially shaped over time due to power systems, and how that influences their present vulnerability to climate change.
I'm joined today with Sasha Maggio-Akono, the Assistant Lab Manager at the Critical Ecology Lab. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
So I'm very curious to know, what do you do as the Assistant Lab Manager? It's such a very broad title.
Yeah, it is a broad title. It's definitely such full of things. I have my hands in a lot of bags, but mainly as the Assistant Lab Manager, I'm here to help with communications. I do the social media for the lab, so everything you're
digital
seeing,
baddie.
yep, everything you're seeing on Instagram and our other channels, that's kind of like my wheelhouse. And I'm trained also as a microbiologist, so I think of it a lot about as like science education in some way.
Yeah, I mean, science communication is really the ways that we've learned all science, like Bill Nye and like other famous scientists who literally paved the way in this community. So I'm really curious to know like what your passion from digital media came from.
Yeah, totally. I love social media just for personal use already.
Yeah.
And I think that I've learned a lot on social media, especially with COVID recently, a lot of that is a source of information, but a lot of time the information doesn't so much happen to be fact-checked, or sometimes it can be a little bit too dense for media output. And that's why with science and with Critical Ecology Lab in particular, I'm so excited to bring scientific fact and work that's done with real research to the media and to people who are interested in this stuff.
Yeah, because one of the biggest issues I see with academia is the fact of translating research papers is often kept in their own silos, and trying to get it out to the public is hard. So at Critical Ecology Lab, it seems like there's these intersections of accessibility, media, culture, and also research-based science. And sometimes those are very heavy subjects to even come together to translate. So how do you do it at Critical Ecology Lab?
Yeah, definitely. You can think of me as like a huge synthesizer, honestly. I do a lot of reading, a lot of listening. I do kind of like the legwork of finding scientific papers, and then I'm able to like chew all that down and bring it out to the public in ways that are not only relatable, but also digestible. So it's not so much about dumbing down the media, because I think that when we say we're dumbing down science, we're definitely losing some of those facts. But it's about making it in a way that people can see themselves in the research and be able to understand what they're looking at, because it's relatable, because it uses words that we use in real life on the day-to-day, you know? Yeah.
Like sometimes when I look at the objective of the paper, that's usually the one I want to read because it's the most accessible. And then everything else, I'm like, no, I don't understand what these models mean. But I really like that, because I think there's often this misconception that making things digestible or accessible is not consumed properly, but instead you're actually synthesizing, you're savoring it, you're sensing it, and you're like interacting with it. And that's what inspires younger generations to feel curious and to see the mix of industries coming together.
Yeah, for sure. I like that last part that you mentioned about mixing the industries and intersectionality specifically when I'm looking at the work in my personal research, and what led me here to Cell was to show that we don't need to keep these boundaries and separations between science and art, science and popular media, science and, I don't know, other sports, whatever you might like, honestly. But bringing these things, weaving them together, parts that you think might not even be connected, is a way to make it more human and make it more palpable for people.
And one of those things to make it palpable is bringing people together in real life. And I know that you all mentioned about the Liberation Ecology course fieldwork class that you all host. So how is it bringing people together and seeing that translated from digital media to in real life?
Yeah, that's super exciting. So the Liberation Ecology field course, I kind of joined the team during the last leg of it. And it's a place where it was really exciting for folks to have access to all of this scientific stuff that we said, learning skills around ecology, but also connecting with each other on an emotional level. Because at the end of the day, when we're doing science, and I speak for myself and my colleagues, there is an emotional component to it. That's our curiosity, that's our want to like connect with the soil, connect with other people. Like ecology is a very social science, and at the end of the day, it's about convening with nature itself and convening with each other, you know? I think that's kind of what the ecology field course was about.
I love it. I need to sign up for it.
Oh, for sure. Please come.
Now that we talked about soil and science communications, you want to go take pictures of soil?
Hell yeah, let's go touch some dirt.
Let's go. I'm here with Jacob Alterman, the field multimedia producer at the Critical Ecology Lab. And how are you doing today?
I'm great. Never better.
I'm really interested to know, what do you do here?
Yeah, so I joined Critical Ecology Lab earlier this spring to assist shooting and editing footage and documenting the Liberation Ecology field course. And so that's been my first project that I'm continually working on right now. But also providing, some social media assets for Sasha, and just generally being around and helping out when I can.
Yeah, can you tell me more of the importance of doing videos when storytelling? Because I think as someone that started off with just writing and doing social media work, I was doing it through infographics and photos, but I feel like videos tell a different story.
Absolutely, yeah. Video, I've been interested in video my entire life. I remember when I got my first video camera as a kid.
Yeah.
It was very exciting for me. But I think the power of video is really, it allows us to see ourselves a lot more clearly when an infographic or text might not allow, or in a way that might not allow. And I think that's especially important here because of the content of the Liberation Ecology field course. It's geared towards people of color, people in their 20s that don't generally get to see themselves in these spaces. While we're out for 6 weeks during that course, I really wanted to highlight the experiences of all these different individuals and, just allow them to see themselves and then allow the broader public to be able to see themselves in these people. So the goal was really just to let the participants' voices shine through and highlight them as their whole selves, A lot of people came from very different ethnic backgrounds, a lot of different gender identities. So, that was really special for me because I never got to see myself in those spaces. Similar to Sue, I really loved science as a kid, but I was never really told I could do that kind of thing. In my creative work, I want to be able to show that anybody can really step into this world, and we all have an important voice to share.
And I feel like you brought back your passion from your original days to what you do now, because I worked in the creative industry after I graduated college, and I had no experience in photography, videography, like anything. But when I engage in that space, I realized it's a different way of a love language to express yourself, and
Absolutely.
I feel that when you tie them in together, it actually creates a new shift in culture. So I feel like those emotions in that video.
That's a really good way to say it. And I love that you brought up emotion because the Liberation Ecology field course was so many things, but it was a really amazing practice in emotional understanding. There were so many moments that we grieved together, we cried together, we laughed together. There's moments of joy, pain, all these things, alongside all the learnings that we had from a scientific standpoint. I think that was really special. It was a really interesting blend of the personal, the professional, the scientific, all at once. And I think that's something that I wasn't really fully prepared for, but I'm so glad that I got to document it and, experience that for myself.
Whose personal story do you feel like touched you the most when you were shooting this? Because I often feel that, different subjects of talent have so many like raw emotions that come out in video, but I feel like there's probably a few or even one that you stuck out to you.
Without going into too much detail, there were so many stories of loss, and that's something that I can really identify with without, just trauma bonding on camera. There were so many experiences of loss, and that could be, losing your home, losing loved ones, losing your culture. One participant shared a story about how he was trying to learn the recipes of his family, and he's Mayan, and he realized that, he could try and try, but he was never going to be able to cook some of these things as well as his grandmother did. And that's something that really stuck out to me because I'm like, wow, I think so many people of color experience loss like that, and it's something you might not even realize right away. That really stuck with me. But he's still trying, and I think the conclusion he kind of came to was like, the work is still worth doing, even though he's not going to be able to do it exactly the same way as his elders. But at least he's still doing it. He's still out there.
And I think it's important that when we talk about ecologies of collapse, like it's not just the fact that biodiversity is dying, it's the fact that the way that we cooked, the way that we used to wear clothes, the way that we used to weave, the way that we used to dance, like those traditions are all being lost at a point and accelerated due to those ecologies of crises that we're facing. And I feel that being able to tell that story is like an act of preservation and self-salvation.
Absolutely. That's really well said. Yeah, I totally feel you. I totally feel you.
I don't have any video experience. I only know how to be on camera sometimes. But
for me, it's the opposite. I'm usually on that end.
On that end, And I think one of the things is that when we think about videography careers, we don't think about saving the planet. We don't think about, it's environmental work. Many of the times when people are exposed to videography, they think about Hollywood or music videos.
Absolutely.
And it's honestly like, it's such a range in which you can enter the industry. So why do you feel like the environmental section should be taught to young filmmakers that are part of their communities to tell stories?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of opportunity was not readily apparent to me coming out of school. I went to school for graphic design. I got into video editing through that. And the pipeline there is usually, you go work for an agency, maybe you shoot some music videos, like you said, go to Hollywood if you want. But after spending 5 years doing this kind of work in DC at a political agency, I realized that it was really hurting my soul. It wasn't working for me, and it caused me to get very burnt out. And I spent the last 2 years really looking to refine my purpose. And, I found Cell at just such an amazing time because I was really reframing my own identity, my professional identity. And then, I just happened to hear this podcast with Sue, the, infamous Ologies podcast. Critical Ecology on the Ologies podcast. And I was like, maybe I should just reach out. And so I sent her an email, and I was just so inspired by the way that she used her voice and the mission statement of Critical Ecology Lab. And so a few months later she got back to me, and I realized that this is something that I could really point my career towards. And it felt like just so much more important than just making advertisements for people to buy something, for people to vote for somebody. It just felt so much more fulfilling for me, and it just I was really drawn to it. So I think it's important for especially videographers and creative people of color to realize that you don't have to just, follow this specific pipeline, even though, that's where so many people tell us we have to go.
Yeah, and everything happens for a reason. I mean,
Absolutely.
if you didn't put yourself in DC to burn out, or if I didn't move to New York to work at a creative agency and burnt out, I wouldn't have understood the larger web of communities that exist out there. And I think, preventing younger people to make wiser decisions sometimes for us, because, we don't want young people to feel like it's the end of the world or that they have no career for their passion. And that's where videography is such a powerful tool on that end.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much again for joining me, Jacob.
Yeah, of course, it's my pleasure.
Yeah, let's go shoot some B-roll.
Let's get it.
All right, let's go. Obviously, so many people then want to engage with the Critical Ecology Lab. So what are the ways that you hope to reach them? Or if someone just really is like, I want to learn more and work for you all, what do you tell them?
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind is we are trying to build out a network of volunteers who want to engage with us in different capacities, whether it be pure volunteership, contract-based work, and even, as I mentioned in the future, part and full-time staff members. And as we grow and as we develop a funder base that can really support the heart and soul of our organization, which is people, we can really develop our capacity to bring more folks in. And the ways that we hope to engage with individuals is, in addition to kind of just, appreciating donations and having people join things like our Patreon, where you can be privy to kind of the behind the scenes work, some of the exclusive content in terms of different talks that we have with experts, the writings and kind of publications, and even a zine that's forthcoming that you can get as a result of being a patron. We also want people to feel like, you might not be a scientist with a PhD or a master's, but you are someone who's found your way to this program, right? You're a curious person and you have the ability to do research online with a team. And so one of the things that we would love to see more volunteers do is engage with us on producing research briefs, short form research papers that are publicly available, that synthesize information and topics that wouldn't otherwise be put together and analyzed together in a sort of scientific and social and justice-focused way. And so I think people out there who might not be scientists are actually really well equipped to volunteer to become knowledge producers in the way,
I love that term,
way.
knowledge producers. It gives agency to them to be like, I may not identify with scientists, but I am a knowledge producer that's shared commonly with a lot of us.
Yeah, exactly right.
Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Suzanne Pierre, for teaching me about critical ecology, but I know that we're going to now do the practice and touch some soil. So let's go and find soil together.
Sounds good.
All right, let's go.